Good morning. We are about to make history come alive at the National Book Festival. Yeah. Ned Blackhawk is a history professor at Yale University and an enrolled member of the Dimok tribe of the Western Shoshone. The author of many books of Indigenous history, his most recent title is The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History, which won the 2023 National Book Award. Kathleen DuVal is a history professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where she teaches early American and Native American history. DuVal's latest book, Native Nations, A Millennium in North America, was longlisted for the Cundill Prize in Historical Literature. The event is moderated by Shelly C. Lowe, a citizen of the Navajo Nation and the chair of the National Endowment of the Humanities. Enjoy the festival, and let's welcome them to our stage.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. This is a beautiful, engaging crowd, and I hope that everybody who's online has a chance to get a little bit of a glimpse of who's in the room. We are so delighted to be here this afternoon with Ned Blackhawk, Kathleen DuVal, and I just want to say, these two books, The Rediscovery of America and Native Nations, are a reminder that the telling of our history is ever-changing, that America is complex and fascinating and sometimes heartrending. And we cannot move forward as a nation, as these both have proclaimed in their books, or as a people until we understand where we've been. So Kathleen and Ned, I want to thank you for being with us today. We're going to delve in a little bit into your books, but not give out too much, because hopefully you'll go get it signed, and you'll be as immersed into the past 2 months of reading that I have been in. So Ned, I'm going to start with a little quote that you have in your introduction. And it says, "Finding answers to the challenges of our time, racial strife, climate crisis, and domestic and global inequities, among others, will require new concepts, approaches, and commitments. And it is time to put down the interpretive tools of the previous century and take up new ones." And I think that you both have taken up new tools in your book. So tell us a little bit about what you were both trying to do in your new books.
Thank you for the kind introduction and for joining us, Shelly, today. And thank you, Kathleen, for coming as well. And thank you all. I'm delighted to be here and honored beyond measure. My new book, The Rediscovery of America, is an attempt to offer a new vision of American history rooted in the field of Native American history. And it takes its title, The Rediscovery of America, from a generation or two of kind of amazing scholarship and a profusion of both academic and tribal initiatives that have yielded far more vast conceptions and paradigms for thinking about American history than we've been previously given. And so actually both of our works are kind of interpretive overviews of broad centuries of American historical formation. And we're both trained in a generation of scholars who've been pushing the field of Native American history forward in ways that would have been inconceivable 25 years ago. And so there has been this kind of monumental seismic reorientation within academic and other adjacent fields to approaching American history that are new. And so these interpretive tools reflect less a kind of Anglo-centric or Eurocentric orientation of American history, less of a teleological kind of narrative of progress and kind of triumphant either expansion and or kind of democratic expansions. And much of the field of U.S. history is still kind of rooted in those kind of older paradigms, many of which are relics essentially of the Cold War era. And so we face contemporary challenges that will require new ideas, new approaches, new methodologies, and ultimately a kind of reckoning that many of us have started to engage with in our own work that we're trying to bring into other areas.
I just want to echo Ned's thanks. It's such an honor to be here with both Ned and Shelly and all of you and talk about our books. So yeah, my book, Native Nations, also grows on this huge turn in history toward Native American history and incorporating Native American history into US history and other sort of global histories. One of the things I wanted to do in my book is tell a long, long history. So it's a millennium of Native history. And I wanted to connect the distant past to the present and things in between, because I think what a lot of Americans, and especially non-Native Americans, know about Native history is a few flashpoints, most of which are quite negative, like Indian removal and some of the sort of horror stories of Native American history. And those are in our books, right? But there's also, what I wanted to do here was to show the much longer history. So Native Nations begins in the era before Europeans and other peoples of the globe came to the Americas. Centers on change and history that was happening in North America long, long before 1492. It stretches through centuries in which Native Americans had a great deal of power, had most of the population and power on the continent, when Europeans were generally here in quite small numbers, and for centuries didn't have the power to take over the continent as much as they might have wanted to. But then also, I think importantly, continues to the present, and it's in some ways a survival story, a heroic story of how peoples who were told over and over that they should no longer exist as Indigenous people refused that lesson and instead survived. And so I think that's why it was really important to include the present in that millennium-long history for me.
Thank you, Kathleen. You know, you bring up a point that I was kind of gravitating towards in your afterwards. You say, in Chapel Hill, where you're at, only 100 miles north of the home in the state where the Lumbees are the largest Indigenous population, they are shocked at the widespread ignorance of Native history and nationhood. The young people face the unreasonable choice between constantly explaining and defending their identities and simply hiding them to make their everyday lives easier. And so you kind of talk about, you know, these new tools in these books. How do you see these playing out with students in your classrooms and in the work that you two are doing?
Yeah. For me, I think for students generally, this is such a tremendously important time. I think they see people like you, Shelly, in the public eye. They see movies and TV and all kinds of places. They see Native Americans in the world today. They're clearly part of modern 21st century America. And that doesn't always square with the way they learn Native American history. And I think for a lot of Americans and for students when they come into my classroom, they're just like, okay, what happened in between? How is this still true? Given that we learned a history that didn't, if they learned any, some of them learned absolutely no Native American history at all. But how did they make that fit with the myths of decline and disappearance that just aren't true? And then for Native students, I think they have taught me so much by sitting in my classes. And what I hope I can provide for them is, Lumbee students, for example, they know infinitely more than I will ever know about being a 21st century Lumbee. And most of them know more Lumbee history than I do. But I hope I can put the Lumbees in this framework of a long history of North America. And for them especially, they're a state-recognized tribe, sometimes told that they aren't real Indians. And I think learning particularly what happened with people who lived on the coast, hit by colonialism so early, long before there was a United States. So I talked, my first answer, I talked about the centuries that it takes for colonialism to hit most of the continent in large numbers and with a lot of power. People in this part of the continent met colonialism very early and very hard, and the fact that they continue to be Native nations today is even more a tribute to just, generation after generation telling kids, this is who you are no matter what people around you say.
It's kind of amazing how relatively unfamiliar the topography of American history is to so many well-educated students and citizens more broadly. And I teach a kind of broad introductory survey of Native American history and routinely have students tell me they've never encountered some of the kind of seminal chapters of the course, which are now chapters in the book. And we're both very familiar with the Revolutionary era's history. And I have students who, are now in law school and, doing very well in their lives professionally, to say things like, I was never aware that there was a French Empire in North America, which was the largest colonial colony in North America before the Treaty of Paris of 1760. And the relationships between indigenous peoples, as Kathleen knows, and many in the field have already established, were very different than the relationships between British and Native peoples in Eastern North America. And so I made a really heavy emphasis in the early chapters of the Rediscovery of America to kind of foreground those relationships and also expose their centrality to the emerging kind of crisis of empire that the British themselves encountered after the decline of French hegemony and authority in the 1760s and the rise of indigenous revolutionaries or kind of militant leaders and millennialist leaders like Pontiac and Neolin, the Delaware Prophet. So those are kind of familiar themes in the study of Native American history in early America now. They weren't when I started graduate school many decades ago. So they've become evidence of this kind of larger rediscovery, but it has never really been disseminated effectively into kind of the larger national realm. And you really can't understand the American Revolution outside of this prior indigenous and imperial context. It's simply impossible. And so it's not incoincidental that some of the most kind of remarkable kind of conflicts between the British Crown and their eventual settlers are occurring in these interior spaces. And so chapter 5 of my new book is on the Revolution. It's called The Indigenous Origins of the American Revolution. It chronicles some of these kind of growing interior conflicts between indigenous peoples and British settlers. And it's not incoincidental that those settlers will bring those grievances to the rest of the colonies and later on in the 60s and into the 70s. And the term savages will make its way into the Declaration of Independence, which is the culminating grievance in the Declaration itself. So where do those ideas come from? What are those kind of ideologies? How have they been excluded? These are real important historical questions that are essential to kind of a civic understanding of this nation. And ultimately, as we were talking about earlier, we haven't been taught these subject matters. They've been kind of reduced or kind of ignored or stereotypically excised from kind of consciousness. And we are all familiar with those stereotypes and those representations. In Peter Pan, which came out in 1953, some of the children tell one another that Indians are cunning but not intelligent. There are kind of so many kind of ubiquitous representations of the older era that we're still living through and trying to counteract. And ultimately, if we don't do that kind of interpretive and analytical work, we're going to be left with empty forms and categories of analysis that ultimately won't solve or help us resolve longstanding conflicts in America.
Thank you. What I really appreciated about both of your books was really the focus on the Native American agency and the role that Native tribes had played actually in so many important historical moments in this country. And Ned, you say, to build a new theory of American history will require recognizing that Native peoples simultaneously determined colonial economies, settlements, and politics, and were shaped by them. And Kathleen, you do a really wonderful job showing us the role of tribal peoples and how they played a role in trade and how they played a role in between our European visitors who had come in and had early encounters. Tell us a little bit more about why it was so incredibly important to tell the story from that standpoint and to make it something that hopefully when we tell American history from here on out, we start with that kind of viewpoint.
Yeah. Okay. I think it's humanizing, right? I think, one of the things I think we were part of, Ned and I have been part of in our early work and being trained in grad school and moving into training our own students is to turn the tables on perspective. And so for so long, and really on purpose, the story of American history was told from one perspective. And now I think in our classrooms and in our books, we're trying to tell it from multiple perspectives. And those early Americans, right, who met the first European explorers or the second or third European explorers or traders, they're human beings like all human beings, and they understand these events that we might have heard about in other ways, like the coming of Columbus, say, from their perspectives and their needs and their histories and their conflicts with one another, some. And so learning about people who like work through those things from those perspectives, I think just immediately changes how you see things. So in one of the chapters, I have it's about Mohawk trade with the Dutch in New Netherland, and there are these letters. Ned and I have come across like documents like this all the time that just surprise you and flip the perspective for you. And so Dutch settlers wrote this petition to complain that Mohawks had so much buying power because they brought in furs and were able to trade those for lots of buying power, that they bought up all the white flour in town. They bought all the cakes and the cookies and everything and the white bread that the Dutch bakers made. And so these Dutch European settlers wrote in this petition, all we get to eat is bran. And that just struck me as like, that really gets at this, how important it is to understand the full set of perspectives and the times in which Europeans really don't know what's going on and don't have the power in the place that they, at the time and for generations forward, will claim belongs to them and should belong to them. It's just not true, right? And it helps, I think, to tell the stories in that other direction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, agency is a big theme now in the field to try to highlight the not just historical, but economic or social or political, but even intellectual kind of influence that Indigenous peoples have had upon not just themselves, obviously, but those around them. And I carry that theme throughout the 19th and into the 20th century to highlight the ways in which even things that we think of as kind of imposed upon Native Americans and or brought to them by Washington have in fact often been either requested for or fought for by Native Americans. So towards the end of the book, there's a chapter on early 20th century Native American activists who were pressuring the federal government for sets of reforms to kind of end the sets of abuses that some of us may be familiar with. I think there's an exhibition of Carlisle Indian photographs on the second floor of this facility, for example. And Carlisle is the first of the many off-reservation boarding schools established by the federal government under the auspices of Richard Henry Pratt that opened in 1879, and that sought to remove Indian children to sever, as one scholar has suggested, the effective bonds between Native American children and their families. And so by removing children from their families, from their communities, and simultaneously trying to disaggregate communal land holdings, the federal government attempted to assimilate American Indians into the body politic of the Republic. And Native Americans fought those intrusions as best they could, and eventually brought reforms to Indian affairs during the New Deal era. And so the laws that we think of as kind of consequential or most consequential in shaping Native American 20th century politics, essentially, were in many ways envisioned by Native activists who have been kind of written out of the history of 20th century America. And very few American Indians ever appear in kind of contemporary visions of modern America. And so that's one of the themes of both of our books and of the field more broadly, is to move past the sense of Indigenous victimization and or disappearance to kind of highlight not just the presence, the survival, but also the creative capacity, active, generative ideas and politics and reforms. And it's, it's really kind of a remarkable story, and I kind of wish most of us had encountered the modern American Indian sovereignty movement as a kind of subject of inquiry prior to maybe graduate training or kind of interested reading on one's weekend, or because these are really remarkable histories that teach us as a nation a kind of different vision of what constitutes rights or justice or power, even democracy. And so American Indian history really offers us a kind of more robust and inclusive and less familiar kind of vision of what it means to be an American.
Yeah, thank you. One of our former NEH council members, Dr. Patricia Limerick, often says to me how, as she has kind of learned more about the boarding school era and some of this work that is coming out, like your work, how ironic it is, all the policies that were meant to destroy Native cultures and Native languages and Native peoples in general have seemed to have done the exact opposite. And you both really kind of tie up your work talking about, Kathleen, you talk about the renaissance of Native people, especially in the late 20th and early 21st century. Ned, you kind of end with the surprising paradoxes of Native resurgence. So you've talked a little bit about what might be driving that, but where do you see this really coming from, and how do you see us moving that forward?
I just completed a long response, so I'll take that back.
Well, I would say the 19th century abolitionist and feminist Sarah Grimke, people would say to her, you know, you're working for women's rights, you're working for Black Americans' rights, but really we've never seen any evidence that they're quite as capable, quite as smart as white men are. And she said, well, take your foot off our necks and then you'll see what we can do. And in some ways I feel like, you know, Native nations have had decades, in some cases centuries, of people, powerful people and institutions trying to make them not exist. And now if you know, maybe right now that has gone away, that active effort to make Native nations no longer nations has gone away, with lots of, you know, things yet to be decided. But I think that's why we're starting to see, you know, or at least I should say, and by we there means someone who's not a member of Native nations, right? Starting to see just the resurgence of public-facing governance and, you know, culture in all of its way, you know, language revitalization, historical preservation, all kinds of things that just, you know, were sort of, you know, limped along out of public view on purpose, that now are coming out and are, you know, so important internally to nations, but also are something that the rest of us can learn from outside of Native nations. And I think, you know, just it's, and I use the word government on purpose because I think a lot of the, you know, tons happens in families and schools, but so much of it is because Native nations are their own government. So one of the things I have my students do is think of a Native nation and go to their tribal website. Right. And they're expecting to find history and things about the past. And you can find that on, you know, one of the tabs, but mostly it's about how you govern, right? It's about childcare, and you all know this, right? And it is such a good reminder that that's as important as lots of different things are in the arts and such. So much of it, I think, is happening because tribal governments are able to reemerge, find bases of revenue, which governments have to have, and then support their citizens in their individual and community and family ways of just a wide variety of places in which they're you know, doing what they want to do.
It's a remarkable moment, actually. And I think from the academic perspective, you can see this kind of transcendence occurring in the field of American history. There's now something called the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, or NASA, that many of us attend. This is becoming actually one of the growth fields within the academy over the last 20 years or so. Publishers are interested. Conferences are attracting sometimes thousands of participants to, and it's not just the US based. And one of the great things about what we call Indigenous studies is its kind of capacity to speak across national borders or across even continental differences. And so scholars from New Zealand and Australia and North America, Europe, Latin America are having a conversation about the place of Indigenous peoples in the modern world. And many of us are noticing or kind of commenting on or writing about this recent resurgence. You have the UN declarations, you have national apologies, you have, though it was slightly muted during the Obama administration here in the United States, but there are kind of moments where you can really identify the kind of visible presence of Indigenous consciousness kind of percolating or kind of sometimes even exploding into national affairs. We had much of that in the United States. You know, when I was a very young child and don't remember much of it, but the American Indian movement, the sets of activist takeovers of places like Alcatraz and Wounded Knee, the sets of kind of monumental congressional legislation that was passed during the Nixon Ford and Carter administrations, the kind of seemingly kind of invisible activism throughout the 1980s that was kind of a darker time in Indian country when very few people understood what Indian affairs were kind of going through. The federal government was getting radically kind of reduced in the early Reagan administration. So the dependency on the federal government yielded a kind of interest in finding economic opportunities elsewhere. And there's some great kind of economic studies of Native America over the last couple of decades that have explored this kind of subject, which I am very proud to have kind of drawn on for the last chapter of my book. So gaming, for example, which comes in kind of a Supreme Court case in '87, followed by a congressional act in '88. Gaming didn't just come out of nowhere, essentially. And so these ideas of government jurisdiction and kind of the presence and growing power of tribes, the ability to start doing things outside of the kind of dependence on the federal government, these are all kind of historic subjects that help explain our kind of modern moment. So we're kind of living through this kind of literary and cultural, and one might even say media kind of renaissance, but it's kind of paralleling or kind of connected to a kind of larger political and economic and kind of social revolution that has been occurring across Indian country for the past 2 generations.
Well, I'm really enjoying this renaissance, let me say.
Yeah.
It's been very fun. I can turn my TV on, there's shows that are native made and native characters, but you know, I know you guys have both been doing quite a few book talks and you've been out presenting. Have you had the opportunity to travel into tribal communities to present to tribal members? And if you have or haven't, either way, what have you found to be kind of the response from tribal communities to your work?
I'm happy. My work, I think, is a few months older than Kathleen.
Yes.
So, I would say that it's still pretty early to ask that kind of, but I know both of us work very closely with students and have collaborated in all sorts of kind of ways with, and I like how you used a lot of oral history towards the end of your book, and have all these nice like family inclusions that I somehow didn't quite have the kind of narrative capacity or kind of understanding to yield myself. But I'm generally very pleased to see tribal community members, less so tribal councils, so to speak, working with me in this and other regards. So I did have a small group of students, including many tribal members, who helped craft the maps in this book, for example. And so I spent a lot of time in emphasizing the kind of heterogeneity and diversity of Indigenous America through visual cartographies, and had a set of maps made that highlight in the contiguous United States all the federally and state recognized tribes. And so you can find that in the end pages of the book. And it really, I think, communicates one of the arguments and lessons of the project as a whole, that there are still tribes, all across the United States within, often, 50-mile radius of most large urban centers, who maintain governments, who are, who have citizens, who have delegated budgets and economies, who run hospitals or healthcare initiatives for their families, and who are government. So that's kind of one of the emphases. And I found tribal members and community representatives kind of responsive. I have to say that neither of these works are, conclusive. Like this is, we're just beginning the kind of retelling of America from a new perspective that's going to take a very long time. And so there is no kind of complete history of the Lumbee in Kathleen's book, or of the Navajo or Lakota or the Crow in mine. But they, communities all kind of start making appearances and kind of convey this kind of sense that this is in fact a kind of intertribal rather than singularly tribal subject matter. And so in my Civil War chapter, for example, you learn a lot about the contestation around certain forts in the West, where the Shoshone and Crow are fighting with the Lakota, and they're all expected to show up in Fort Laramie in 1851 and negotiate a diplomatic accord together. And they're very reluctant to do so because their concerns are more with one another than with the federal government. And so that kind of intertribal diversity is present now. It was present 50 years ago. It was present 200 years ago. It was present 1,000 years ago. So this kind of diversity is essential if one wants to make sense of the subject, which I think we all, on some level are all kind of aspiring to do, one has to begin by recognizing the diversity of this kind of subject matter.
Well, this book, for me, in some ways, came out of conversations with the Quapaw Tribe's Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, because my first book, my dissertation book, was on sort of early American. We both have come out of early American historiographies, and Quapaws featured largely in there. And I started to learn from the Quapaws as they also used my book, and I got to know some people there. But what he and other Quapaws I met kept connecting me, their history, to the longer past and to the present in ways that I didn't know to do in my first book. And it really was over a decade or so of having those conversations that it slowly sort of sunk into me that I wanted to tell a longer history. And so I was able to sort of bring some of those things into my book, sort of the way that Quapaws and other peoples that I talk about sort of connect their distant ancestors' past, as different as it might have been. This is not in any way a story of stasis, it's of change in history, but that there is a long history that connects that and the very things that are going on today and the very understandings that happen today, that's all part of a continuous history. And so, I did, like Ned's book, mine is pretty new, and so I'm waiting to hear sort of what some of the wider reception is, but I hope having it rooted in some of those conversations is evident in the book.
Exactly. Well, these are very informative books. If you haven't seen them,
Long.
they're long. But what the fun thing, they're long, and you're like, oh, I got to read all that. About almost a quarter of both of your books are endnotes and references. And so these are very well researched books that aren't over a couple of decades. We're talking about a couple centuries or more, Tell us a little bit, or tell, the aspiring authors and researchers, students who might be in the audience, what was that process like? How did you start the research? How long did it take? Where were you going? What did you find surprising? What did you enjoy the most?
It took a long time in my case. I don't want to speak for both of us, but I think, as Ned has said several times here, there's been this generational shift, or there's been this shift for about a generation or two maybe in people writing smaller scale books on particular subjects that really show Native power and presence in all of these different eras. And so my books certainly wouldn't be possible without that couple of generations of scholarship. And so those footnotes are very full of secondary sources as well as primary sources, like works that other historians have written and published. And so, it was sort of building on that, building on primary sources in a variety of ways, primary sources being written sources, but also oral histories and an awful lot of other things. I'd say one thing that surprised me, I was writing in the things that happened 1,000 years ago, there aren't written documents for that. So I knew I would use archaeology and I would use oral history. And one of the things that surprised me is how, when I just started looking at specific places, I was looking at Cahokia, which is in Illinois, Moundville in Alabama, and among the Hohokam in what's now Arizona and the Mexican state of Sonora. And I was really surprised at how well the archaeology and the oral histories spoke to each other, that the oral histories that have been maintained for 1,000 years still say things about major changes that happened 1,000 years ago. So there's a period of cities falling. And really across the continent, very different peoples today. Some of their oral histories talk about why those cities fell and why their ancestors created a new way of living on the land. And so I thought I would be sort of, having to test, the oral history tells us more here, but it doesn't, say the same thing the archaeology does. And that's, that really surprised me how, in some ways, my job was so easy because the oral history could just kind of lead me through the meaning of the archaeology.
I think it would really stun our audience if they heard that not only has this now become a very vibrant academic field of study, but it's one that has roots so deeply entrenched in the kind of scholarly infrastructure of America more broadly. So you can't really, like if you go through the National Portrait Gallery, walk through the 19th century art section without encountering dozens of Native American imagery through Catlin and Bierstadt and others who are profiled there. The whole entire discipline of American anthropology, arose from the study of Native peoples. And even in history, which has a slightly somewhat infamous standing in Native American studies for having ignored the subject for so long, many of the most famous kind of American historians from the 19th century were, deeply interested, if in problematic ways, with Native Americans in the process of Western American settlement. And so the kind of archaeology of knowledge within American history, in many ways, has Native Americas in its foundational spaces. One could look at literature as well. And so in the kind of vast kind of constellation of American academic fields of humanistic inquiry, Indians essentially have entered into in so many ways. And so there's a universe, really, of scholarly and kind of academic information to draw upon. You also have tribal, not just oral histories, but tribal and cultural preservation initiatives. And I was astonished, having read Amy Lonetree's great book, Decolonizing Museums, which I teach regularly. I was astonished when I went back to it. One of the things I learned is that there are over 200 tribal either cultural centers and or museums in North America. And in Connecticut, we have the largest as well as the oldest. And that's something that had I not come to Yale 15 years ago, I would not have ever really known about. And so all across the country, there are literally nearly 200 tribal cultural centers and or museums that offer this kind of new vision, or kind of particularly rooted or kind of blended methodological kind of reinterpretation that shouldn't be excised from Ivy League history departments or kind of leading academic institutions, which they often still are. So it's very hard to find this information in many kind of well-known academic or campus communities, but it's there. Yeah. And so any of you wanting to learn about these subjects, and so it's kind of remarkable that we're kind of part of a generation that is finally now bringing overviews to a subject that is literally, nearly 2 centuries old as a professional study. Right.
Yeah, very true. So who are some of the scholars or authors or individuals who have, you have kind of looked to in their work to guide what you've done?
I did mention Amy, who's a great book, Decolonizing Museums. We know a lot of people in common, so I don't want to suck up take your momentum, because I could even talk about some of Kathleen's students.
Right, please.
Please, okay. So, for example, in the last 15 years, several of the most venerable academic institutions in the country have hired and tenured, which is an incredibly important thing in professional academia, hired and tenured Native American history professors. This has happened at Yale, then at Harvard, Columbia, and then Princeton.
Sorry.
And so Princeton recently hired and tenured one of UNC's illustrious students named Elizabeth Ellis, who wrote a remarkable book on the colonial history of Louisiana. It's called The Great Power of Small Nations. Remarkable in its depth of research and the kind of suggestions and its kind of major reorientation. And it's not just a kind of history of the colonial era. It kind of critiques the kind of vision of Southern history that Faulkner and others kind of established, that knew about a mystical indigenous presence that seemingly was always fading away or disappearing. But her research with, I think there's 5 federally recognized tribes in Louisiana, all kind of highlight these themes of survival and endurance and adaptability. And so they've been small nations essentially throughout the last half millennia, if not full millennia. So the kind of themes of her work kind of crystallize or embody kind of this larger kind of academic transformation that many are doing. Some of our earlier work would fall into a kind of field that I've sometimes called Indians and Empires, in which in the colonial era it's so evident to establish and study and kind of identify how indigenous peoples were so central to the evolution of all the major imperial projects in North America, from the Spanish in the Southwest, to the French in the Northeast, to the Dutch along the Hudson, to the British in the Chesapeake, the Piedmont, and in New England. All of those colonial worlds would not have survived without indigenous peoples. It's simply, they're the vast forms of laborers, they provided the vast preponderance of trade, they defended and or fought alongside, in the French case, with French military officials, often against other indigenous peoples. You simply can't understand what used to be called early colonial America without these indigenous subjects. So there's a kind of universe, as I said earlier, of academic studies that kind of are inspiring us to try to bring together in this kind of unwieldy, centuries-long ways, this kind of new vision of America.
Right, yeah, I have a further reading section in the back that has lots of things everybody should read. I would just throw in, since we mentioned boarding schools, a couple of terrific books about really understanding boarding schools from the inside and in all their complexity by Brenda Child and Amanda Cobb Greetham. And then since we're at the National Book Festival, I would just say, my bedside table is about to fall in on me at night with all the novels and poetry that I have there that I haven't even gotten to read, but just tremendous things going on in novels and poetry. My favorite poet at the moment is Natalie Diaz, who's just does an amazing poet, but yeah, I'm not going to start listing because that'll get boring.
Well, I think you've shared a lot about what's in the book, how we can kind of reframe our thinking about history and the role of Native people. So for the individuals who read your book and for our audience today, what are you really hoping they walk away with? Either it's ideas or even more specifically, where do we go from here after we've been introduced to all of this work?
I would hope in mind by looking at this millennium, there are two lessons people take away. One is the long, long history, much more than a millennium, obviously, of Native nations on these continents. And then the second is just that word nation. And so I think that takes me sort of to the second part of your question, that Native nations have been polities for longer than we can even know. And they still are today. And as we move into the future, that they are part of the landscape of governance, as well as just sort of the mosaic of the American people, right? They are nations moving us forward. So if you look at the COVID relief bill or the infrastructure bill, tribal nations are right there alongside counties and states. And I think that is just a tremendous, it's a practical, real thing, but it's also a symbol of that. As we move forward, tribal governments are going to be part of our answers, whatever good or bad answers we get. They're going to be part of the answers to how do we live together and how do we function as one country that's also made out of many countries.
And ultimately, as you kind of conclude, and as I kind of gesture also in my ending, there is an imperiled kind of challenge constantly across Native America that's rooted in part out of non-Native ignorance. And that federal officials, Supreme Court justices, and so many other kind of, particularly state leaders, have never been exposed often to these subjects. And they have recently, we may all know that there is a kind of rising, not just tide of consciousness, but even kind of political standing of Native peoples. First cabinet secretary, lieutenant governor of Minnesota, who may become potentially governor, several congressional representatives over the last few years. This kind of rising tide is changing that kind of level of regional, often ignorance or misunderstanding. But it's really incumbent upon all Americans to try to re-educate ourselves to kind of realize the limits of the kind of received paradigms of information or categories of analysis we've been given, and embrace a vision of ourselves, essentially nationally, that includes this distinctiveness. Because if this distinctiveness is conflated as a kind of singular community of people, it loses its capacity to argue certain political dimensions. And I know you mentioned in the end your several recent Supreme Court cases, one of which was a challenge to the Indian Child Welfare Act, one of the kind of signature congressional statutes that kind of codified the Indian self-determination or Red Power era. And so you really can't understand the modern Indian sovereignty movement outside of these congressional laws that Native peoples have been fighting for decades, if not generations. And keeping Indian children within their communities has been a long-standing concern for Native peoples in terms of foster and adoptive and removal practices. So that case came before the Supreme Court last summer. And it was uncertain what that outcome was going to be. Fortunately for Indian country, the justices upheld the constitutionality of that law, but left in question certain elemental concerns. Are tribes essentially political communities or races? And if they're races, can they essentially legislate, or can the federal government legislate certain protections for them against other peoples? And so that's the challenge, 14th Amendment challenge, that has been brought to numerous initiatives designed to protect sovereign Native nations. So this is a conversation that we as a nation have never really had.
Yeah.
But it's reaching a point where we can start beginning to highlight this. And I would give you a long, boring lecture if you wanted on how the Constitution emerged out of this imperial crisis of the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, and how the Constitution holds within it a certain protection of the federal government's supremacy over Indian affairs that's rooted in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And so that's the beginning of what we would call federal Indian law and policy, which is a big theme throughout the second half of this book. So I've been teaching this for some time, so I can kind of draw upon that if needed, but I don't think we have time, do we?
Well, thank you. That was very helpful, because that leads me into my last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience for a couple of questions. So Ned, you write in your introduction, our history must reckon with the fact that Indigenous peoples, African Americans, and millions of other non-white citizens have not enjoyed the self-evident truths of equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness proclaimed at the nation's founding as inalienable rights belonging to all. So given both of you, your work that you've just done, and maybe you've already answered this question in a way, how would you like to see us commemorate the 250th? And what can be done in light of the work that you've done and how you've informed us?
I remember the bicentennial. When I was about this big, and the coins changed. The Statue of Liberty ended all like NewsHour shows for a year, and there was all this kind of even like Apollo Creed was dancing in Uncle Sam outfit. All these kind of icons of a national celebration, which at the time I didn't think of as exclusive or threatening in certain ways. Maybe I was being naive and I was just too young to think about these things, or I didn't have the language to approach it, which obviously I didn't. But I would hope that when we reach this point, we as a nation are not kind of prone to kind of polarized perspectives on this subject, but really informed ones. And perhaps learning these subjects will help lead to a kind of a more informed conversation rather than a kind of shortened one on ultimately the origins and expansion of our republic, which started with 13 former colonies turned states and quickly spread across a continent, home to the hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of others that I was writing about there.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I remember the bicentennial too, but I think, for all of its shortcomings, maybe I'm misremembering because I was so little, but I think it brought Americans together in a certain way.
Right.
And I think this one's going to be different. It's already different, even from the top. The America 250 Commission includes tribal governments right there with other governments that are involved in the planning. I think, I hope what it'll do is, of course it's not going to, but I hope it will bring all Americans together to this sort of wiser, more sophisticated, but equally hopeful, I think, view of a more complicated American past and present. One of the just more practical things is, at the time of the Revolution, most of North America was Indian country. It's and just to sort of connect that to today, that so much of it actually still is, would be one of the lessons I hope we sort of learn in the moment and then take forward into the future.
Thank you. Excellent. We have a few minutes for audience questions. If anybody would like to come up. Oh, we have one already.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I wanted to get in line first. Thank you for speaking on the subject with grace and respect. Reading Buffalo Woman Come Singing by Brooke Medicine Eagle has enlightened me with the spiritual story of the white buffalo woman. I'm curious if you have heard of the white buffalo calf birth in Yellowstone over the summer and what that could mean spiritually for Mother Earth and Native tribes that follow her story, and if that can usher in a shift in the use of Indigenous knowledge to solve modern problems. Sorry.
That's okay. Shelly, are you interested
Maybe Shelly
in
can
joining us in this conversation?
These are the panelists. I think that, yes, I think that for all of us, that's a really good presence to kind of point to say that things are shifting in some ways and we should be paying attention. On this side.
Hi, Mitakiapi. I'm Cindy Hole, Dakota of the Santee Sioux Nation and president of the American Library Association. We're so grateful that you're here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your work. As this is sponsored by the Library of Congress, would you please share with us how important libraries were to you during your research? As we see universities across the country and even other library types being closed due to a lack of funding or support, we're at a critical point where librarians need to be supported, and we need our authors to be able to have access to information and these bodies of knowledge. Please share the importance of libraries. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. Yeah, give the audience. I mean, this may be almost literally speaking to the choir here at this event, but I mean, if the most visual way to see this importance is if you just looked at the captions in all the illustrations in my book. Library of Congress is a full third of them. Library of Congress makes high resolution images available on their website to download on demand and use as you want, as you know, so many of our federal institutions do. And then the others are from UNC's library or other libraries that give permission to people to use these precious pieces of our past, Native American history, things that, you know, have to be uncovered, but they are there. Like, we couldn't write this history if documents, in many cases written by colonizers who in no way intended this kind of book to come out of them, right, hadn't written things down, and then they got carefully preserved. The Library of Congress or the National Archives or the Kansas Historical Society or someplace, and you know, we're there for us and countless other scholars and interested publics to find them. I mean, history, people worry about a statue being taken down. History would be lost without archives and libraries.
Yeah, I'm totally a product of a kind of life in and around library systems. I know it sounds strange, but sometimes we end up with library ID cards, and we kind of keep them. They're like old driver's license. You know?
That's true.
And so at every stage of my academic career and development, I've been deeply immersed within a kind of usually a university or kind of historical society or independent library, like the Newberry Library in Chicago, which has the best bibliographic collection in the field of Native American history. We can't understand American history without libraries, and libraries need books and librarians and archivists. And so cutting funding or limiting the acquisition or shifting exclusively to a digital format is not going to help redress the kind of educational deficiencies that we've been discussing this afternoon. So I'm really grateful of the work that you're doing as well. And one thing that might be interesting that I don't know, and maybe you could help us learn, is how many tribal libraries are there within this kind of world of, because many of these cultural centers that I reference have within them library systems, and so, or libraries. So you can see the kind of growing power of tribes to harness and reharness kind of history in certain ways, and libraries, often written, full of books written by non-Indians, have been very helpful in those processes.
Thank you. And we have hundreds of tribal libraries across this country.
Right, thank you so much for sharing that.
Wopita Tonka, thank you.
Very well said, thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. I recall an interesting exhibit in the Smithsonian American Indian Museum about who qualifies to be an Indian, and that the laws differed state by state. You had to be 100% Indian, you had to justify it with some type of proof, 75%, 50%, and it varied state to state. And this was important in order to qualify for either affirmative action or remuneration or things like that. And I would like to know, in your opinions, how do you handle affirmative action and remuneration to American Indians?
Well, I'd say the most important thing, and they can correct me if I don't say it right, is citizenship in a particular Native nation. And so citizenship in a particular Native nation is a mutual recognition by that nation and by the individual that that individual is a citizen, is a member of that community. So there have been plenty of efforts by states, by the federal government, to say who is Indian and who's not. But at its heart, the most important thing is whether a nation and that individual recognize each other as that individual belonging to that nation.
Yeah, this is one of the misunderstood elements of contemporary American society, essentially. This kind of presumption that all American Indians now are receiving the gaming revenue streams, which is not true. And so I can't remember the exact percentages, but only 20% of tribal nations manage casinos, and of those 20%, only a certain percentage actually turn profitable revenue return. So that may have changed in the last decade or so, but the vast majority of American Indian citizens are not receiving the kind of remunerations, if that's the kind of suggestion. Many tribes are fighting for restoration of particular lands, resources, as well as certain types of claims against the federal government. And there were over 100 tribes that filed claims against the federal government for either sanctioning or illegally taking tribal lands throughout the 19th century following the passage of a law called the Indian Claims Commission Act. And so there's something called the Indian Claims Commission over the last 50 years that heard over 100 claims by tribal nations. But the question you're asking is about membership or citizenship, as Kathleen mentioned. And it's not determined by states. So tribes themselves within states have the authority to determine who is and is not a member of their community. They often make that membership determination based on the imposition of congressionally established governing requirements through something called the Indian Reorganization Act, which required tribes to adopt constitutions to elect a tribal council and establish a membership criteria based on a quarter of Indian descent. A blood quantum requirement. So that's the federal, if we were to say, what is the federal government's recognition of tribal membership requirements, we would say that. Even though tribes themselves have reformed in over 400 constitutional changes, their own constitutions to reflect their own concerns. And so the Cherokee, the Navajo Nation, my tribe, they all have differential membership standards, essentially.
So a quarter is one grandparent.
Well, it's descent on a census roll. And so to be a member of a tribe means to be a descendant from either census rolls taken for or with the tribe in a certain time period. But it could be multiple members of one's family. This is a very complicated subject because, as you can sense, it's not just a mathematical, but political, and it's also historical, and it's very emotional as well. But many tribes are move past this requirement. They're changing their constitutions. Many recognize Indian descent. So you can be a recognized member of a tribe through descendancy, and they'll offer a kind of citizen certificate of Indian descent, essentially. So you can, and that is essentially a tribe's recognition of your relationship with them through a process of descent from a tribal member. So it's a very obviously complex subject. that is very hard to explain in a world where many of us believe that certain types of multiple citizenships might not be maybe constitutional.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the wonderful question and for the attempt to answer what can take an entire semester to be able to answer. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I do want to acknowledge everyone who wanted to ask a question and say that they will be signing books at 1:30, so they're not going anywhere. And I do, as we close out, Kathleen, I want to just state one of the sentences in your conclusion. You state, as in the past, solutions live with Native peoples themselves and the determination of the rest of us to listen to them. So I want to thank both of you for all of the work that you have done to help us listen to Native people. I want to thank the audience for joining us today. Encourage you, please go check out their books. Please go have them signed. And please join me in thanking Ned and Kathleen for their work.
Thank you.